Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I'm delighted to welcome back Dr. Jaan Islam. You're most welcome, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you for inviting me.
Yep, it's great to see you again on BT. Dr. Jaan is a political theorist who specializes in decolonial theory and Islamic jurisprudence. He completed his PhD on pre-modern conceptions of divine sovereignty at the University of Edinburgh and worked as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oxford. His recent works include Islam and the State in Ibn Taymiyyah, Translation and Analysis, published by Routledge in 2022, and a jihadi critique of the modern state, published in Political Theory. He's currently assistant professor in political theory at Boğaziçi University, Istanbul in Turkey. Just forgive me my pronunciation of your university. Today, we're going to be discussing his most recent and truly fascinating paper, which I'll link to in the description below, entitled Divergent Statecrafts Between Islamic Governance and Modern State Power. A very interesting, rich article full of observations, analysis, historical, theoretical, Islamic, and so on. Very, very interesting. So thank you for that. So you want to start off perhaps by introducing us to the paper. I know you have a couple of slides to share.
Sure thing.
Thank you.
Let me just see if I can. Perfect. I also have some notes here. All right. Well, firstly, Paul, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure, as always, to be able to speak about the topics that are important to my academic work, but more importantly to the Ummah. And I want to first start off by saying that the purpose of this presentation is to highlight or discuss the potential for an alternative to existing debates on whether or the extent to which Islam is compatible with the modern state, the extent to which Islam is compatible with the nation state. And although it's a very long paper and there are a lot of different subjects that are covered, I'm going to try my best to summarize everything in a short period of time. So please, I ask the audience as well to forgive me for my deficiencies in explaining a number of difficult subjects in a short period of time, but inshallah, we can have the barakah in that. So the first thing to discuss or to ask is, why is this question important? Yeah. And I think this question is one of the most important questions of our time, because following colonialism and the imposition of colonial power and political systems on the Muslim world, we have a number of legacy colonial institutions and governance which has essentially secularized and modernized our lives, and also the government and law, to such an extent that people today think Islamic change isn't possible, or it isn't even necessary. And although we know this is something that's prophesied, it's going to happen, it is also equally important for us to say, okay, if this is going to happen, then what are the obstacles and what are the social and political realities that exist that we have to understand in order to sketch out a theory and a praxis for Islamic unity. And so essentially today, I guess in the main debate that's being had is between two perspectives. One is the so-called Islamic modern approach, or the Islamist approach, whatever you want to call it, which is essentially it views these theorists view the state as a neutral vehicle for social and political change. So in other words, the institutions, the Shura, the parliament, which you can call the Shura Council, the taxation, levels of taxation, and the public education and police, everything can be used to underpin any ideology, whether it's capitalism or it's communism or whatever, and therefore can also be used to underpin and to enforce social change in Islam, or Islamic change. So that's, and this is probably a majority opinion among theorists, at least within the last 100 years. And on the other hand, we have the so-called Halakian approach, and I'm sort of, it's not 100% accurate because Halak wasn't the only person to make this point, but in any case, Halak basically famously made the argument in his Impossible State that the institutions and the processes of these institutions, the cognitive processes, the ethics, and the substance of the modern state, of these colonial states, are simply antithetical to everything that is Islamic. whether it's taxation or it's state mandatory education, surveillance, censorship, which occur under all nation states, including capitalist and so-called liberal democratic nation states, then the question is, or the argument is, that Islamic change must occur outside of the state. And that's something which I hope to illuminate in this paper. And then finally, there is a third approach, which, to be honest, it does not directly contradict the Halakian approach, but it sort of seeks to reorient the discussion from an Islamic perspective, which is to say that the question of what is right and wrong, or what is Islamic and non-Islamic, is not whether it is in agreement with modernity or it opposes modernity. Anti-modernity is not necessarily Islam, and Islam is not necessarily anti-modernity on every single subject. And for that reason, for that reason, we have to ask ourselves from an Islamic perspective, what is permissible, or we have to use the framework of fiqh or jurisprudence to determine whether something is permissible, or it's recommended, or it's makruh, or it's something else. That should be our measuring stick in determining something as acceptable or not. And so, having said this, I think the notion of the state itself is still a bit abstract. And in answering this question, engaging the extent to which Islam is compatible with the modern state, we have to ask ourselves, okay, what are the areas of potential contention that the state has, that the modern state has with Islamic principles and ethics? And the first of those, Brother Paul, is basically, this is something that I think is the easiest to understand, is the notion of a defined territory and a national identity, that you are a citizen and you are given rights, and the state supports your rights because of the place you were born or the bloodline that you belong to, as opposed to your belief in Allah and His Messenger, and your Islamic identity, and the fact that you are a member of the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is what really matters, and the nation state immediately, very directly contradicts this, which I'll elaborate more on in the following slide. Secondly, you have centralized power and control, and this is again an abstract concept, but if we're sort of understanding it practically, we can say that it is the government reducing the autonomy of an individual citizen in the nation state through any means. It could be through corrective means, it can be through punishment, it can be through surveillance, it can be through psychological manipulation, through public education. These are all means of power and control. The fact that you have to send your kid to school and you don't have the ability, for instance, in many states to educate them, or there's a pressure to do so, there's a pressure to conform. These are all acts of centralization. A non-centralized state would not necessarily have these same institutions.
Can I just interrupt your wonderful presentation there? It just reminds me so much, what is the modern state? Your question. The epitome, the archetypal modern state, for me, it's just my personal view, is France itself, because it has all these characteristics to the nth degree. The centralization of power and control in Paris, the nation is defined as the nation state and national identity, the territorial aspect to it, the national identity aspect to it, being a Frenchman or Frenchwoman is central, financial centralization in Paris, bureaucracy, boy, is there bureaucracy and rationalization in France, big time. And your identity as a Muslim in France, it really is totally non-consequential. It's not even recognized. Surveys of population don't even take into account the fact that you're a Muslim. They refuse to do so because of laicite, secularism. So for me, the uber modern state is exemplified by France. It's not the only one, but it epitomized in a very pure form all the characteristics that you have defined in what constitutes a modern state. So I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, and French history is actually important to that, because the notion of France is very new. Not all people in France spoke French at one time.
In the 19th century, most people in France, people don't believe it's actually true, most people in France in the middle of the 19th century did not speak French as their first language. And it was state policy to enforce French on the people of that territory, France. And that's why they all speak French now. Not because French people spoke French. They didn't until quite recently. You're right.
Absolutely. And so to continue along that theme, related to the power centralization of power, is for power you need money. And so there is also a financial centralization. There's a high level of taxation. There are a lot of many dues and tariffs and taxes that you have that are imposed upon the citizens, and it very much takes sort of the feudal system and institutionalizes it and centralizes it under that of the state, where citizens are equal, but everyone is equally indebted and subservient to the state. And lastly, this is one that's perhaps a bit hard to theorize, at least for me, it was hard to understand, is bureaucracy and rationalization. And what we can, the way we can basically explain this is the redefinition of natural human actions. You do business, you get married, you know, whatever a normal person does, under centralized, rational, uniform procedures that funnel the citizens' actions. So your communication is sort of put through this. You go, you buy a phone, you fill out a form, you put in your national ID number, it's connected to this, it's funneled through the state. Yes, you have a right to travel, you can have a passport, but you have to apply and get the passport in order to have the right to travel. The rights are given by the state to you. If the state didn't exist, you would still have those rights. Right? If you just existed on the earth naturally with nobody else, these are things that you wouldn't need the state to do them. But the point here is that the state uniformly brings everybody under these under these sort of cold rational procedures, and in doing so devalues traditional and interpersonal procedures and forms of living and concepts of consent, all under the state. And we're going to see how this is very much contradictory to the Islamic perspective. Finally, I'll mention from a government perspective, again, this concept, for instance, of decision-making through parliamentary procedures and voting, getting royal assent, you know, passing the bills. These are all modern contemporary things that developed over the last few hundred years. There are very few things about the social nature of the social process of legislation, for instance, even if it's not, you know, on a major issue, the legal procedures, the cognitive deliberation process that you could say is Islamic. So this is to understand the state. Now, the question here is, okay, if that is the modern state, then how does Islam, how can we theorize Islam as in agreement with or in contradiction to the modern state, and in what ways? And the current sort of, again, I'm simplifying things, but the current sort of state of Islamic political theory says that you have two options. One of them is you live as a pre-modern person with outside of the technological grid, outside of the capitalist system, and that's the only way you can have anything, you know, outside of the gaze of the state, and the only government you can have, because taking over and reforming the state itself is something that's way too difficult and would take too many natural resources, etc. This is Halak's argument, and that's the reason why he doesn't believe the Islamic State, that something like an Islamic government can pop up again. And secondly, of course, him as a non-Muslim who doesn't believe in prophecy, that you know, the entirety of the earth, the east and the west, is going to be under the dominion of the ummah, and that's not something in his concern. He's looking at it from a secular or from a political perspective. On the other hand, you have the other opinion which says, you know what, actually, wholesale adoption of the nation state and all of its institutions is perfectly Islamic, and I'm going to go and get a whole bunch of fatwas, and we can join the political what do you call it, institutions and all that kind of thing. And this is not in contradiction to you know, Islamic law. So I guess the point here is a third space possible, or if we were to theorize something or move towards an agreement or a consensus between these two sides, what can we do? And for me, this requires reorienting this discussion from, you know, if we're looking at things from a normative perspective, it's in Islam versus the state, or it's Islam versus modernity, for instance, we create this dichotomy, and this is something that Halak also does. Whereas if we approach these questions from the perspective of Islamic law or from fiqh, then we quickly come to the realization, this is something Salman Yunus nicely put, he said that, you know, Islamic law has 5 categories. There is no 6th category of impossible. Something is either permissible, or it's an obligation, or it's you know, recommended, or it's you know, it's prohibited, etc. You have 5 categories. Everything falls under those 5 categories, and therefore, you know, devising a government or a state or a praxis, a trajectory for action cannot, by definition, considering that the deen of Islam is perfect, it cannot be impossible and it cannot be unknown. So the question is, okay, what is that? Or what is that solution, or that how can we pave that path? And the first thing, going back to the previous slide, or relating to the previous slide, again, perhaps the easiest to understand is the notion of Islamic unity. that loyalty and friendship and rights are on the basis of a person's relationship and subservience to their creator instead of the state. So the idea, for instance, that you can have citizenship based on where a person is born, and that a Muslim, who traditionally deserves all of the rights of a Muslim, has less rights if he's not a citizen than a non-Muslim who does have a citizenship, again, is something completely, entirely in contradiction to the core essence, forget about Islamic law, to the core essence of Tawheed, which is that every Muslim is the friend of another Muslim, has the obligation, the requirement to respect them and to give them their due rights. You also have very wide level of freedom and rights given to non-Muslims, but this is first and foremost given to Muslims. In other words, the identity and the national identity can't be on the basis of a certain area or that kind of thing. And for this reason, Brother Paul, I would say that a number of so-called Islamic movements who argue for the compatibility of Islam and the state immediately fail the second we enter into the subject of citizenship, because here there's a very direct contradiction. This is something we're seeing in Syria. It's something that we saw in Afghanistan. So-called Islamic change is really directly, this contradiction is most clearly apparent in this area. Secondly, there is what I call self-government and decentralization. We have to recognize that unity, real unity, political unity, religious unity, etc., requires organic self-governance of societies, as opposed to centralization and uniformization of all of the citizens. If you look at the Rashidun Caliphate, again, they didn't have the technology, but they somehow managed to maintain very clear, standards of operation and objectivity and communication and standards of justice, appointing people, etc., despite not having any of those official procedures. The Ottoman Empire similarly had, the millet system, which I won't elaborate on. But the point here is that this can be done, and this will relate to the third point. But I'll finally say on this point that, again, related to political decentralization, there has to be financial decentralization. And the very fact that an Islamic state, this is my argument and something that a number of Islamic political theorists disagree with me on, which is that the state cannot tax people beyond the stated or legislated taxes. So, like the zakat and the kharaj, those are which are clearly defined. In other words, you can't just go and tax people, progressive taxation, take 50% of their wealth, put that into the system, and because you don't have those financial resources, you're not able to spend them on centralizing projects like education, like censorship, like the police state, like surveillance cameras and everything else. So there's a relationship, a symbiotic relationship between the political and the financial. And then with regard to decision making and sort of organic styles of organic decision making and taqwa centered governance, we can imagine this on the level of the government and on the level of an Islamic the interaction between the citizen and the state. So from the level of the government, we basically have Islamic governance really is, or institutions are defined by or are characterized as highly interpersonal, and they use taqwa as, fear of God, as the social currency on which decisions are made and on which people are appointed to positions, etc. This is very essential to the concept of Islamic governance, as opposed to the modern state, which takes utility maximization or technocracy or efficiency as the main social currency that applies to or that is given value in the state or in the government culture. And here comes the point on Islamic akhlaq, sort of being in contradiction to centralizing centralization and uniformity. The more akhlaq and adab and internal regulation that you have among the citizenry, the more habitus, or as Sabah Mahmoud called it, or the more that people embody the social processes of fearing God in their lives, the less you need centralized regulations and control over the citizenry, because that's something that comes from the inside. The volition comes from the inside. And this is where Weber disagreed. And he was like, no way, this is the opposite. Centralization and rationalization is more objective, and it's better and more efficient. And I think the best refutation for that, Brother Paul, is if you look at the Muslim world, you can see that no amount of procedures or bureaucracy can reform corrupt people if they want to be corrupt, or they want to, seek loopholes in the law.
But also, positively speaking, this fear of Allah rather than the fear of state, that this kind of you put there in that table very interestingly. So I've seen it in places like Qatar and many other places where thieving and theft and public disorder and antisocial behavior is quite rare, actually, or even non-existent as far as I can see in some places in the Muslim world. And this is not because of a repressive surveillance state, watching everyone. No. It's this internal self-control which comes from fear of Allah, as you put it, taqwa-centered governance. And this seems to be, in other words, Islam, another way of putting it, is something that regulates people's lives. People want to do well to please God. They want to avoid punishment from God. That it's not the state, it's God. It's a theocentric civil society rather than a fear of the state kind of polity, which seems to be operational. And it makes a real difference in terms of civil society, the quality of people's lives. Yes, there's corruption, all that exists as well. But on the level, it's really quite surprising as a Westerner when you go there and you see how different things are in many of these places. And this is all to do with Islam. It's not to do with the kind of Western understandings of an intrusive state forcing everyone to conform in certain ways.
And you don't need to go back to the Khilafah Rashida time to see that. This is the point. And so this really actually, thank you for mentioning this, Brother Paul, because this brings me right into the final point that I had on subject-state interaction, which is to say that this concept of a God-centric and Allah-centric approach to government is manifests itself in the individual subject. The subject is a subject of God, not a subject of the state. And so the example of this is in social regulation and crime and punishment, it shifts the fear of the state to a fear of God. And so in this regulation, this is something that takes place in society. It's not only individual. In addition to the individual, you have the concept of shame. The famous hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, if you do not have shame, then do as you wish, right? And today we have the concept of shame is so removed from our societies that people will take this literally and literally do whatever they want. But the point here is that, and I'll give you, the book In Defense of Flogging, the famous book that Muslims use in order to sort of back up their position on had punishments. The argument in that book is actually different. The argument in Defense of Flogging is that the pain that a person experiences from the punishment prevents them from doing it again.
Is this the book? Or maybe not. Just in Pain for the Corporal Punishment of Criminals, Graham Newman.
You have the...
Let me just...
No, there's one. It's called In Defense of Flogging. It's a bit more of a popular book.
Oh, I see. This is an academic book by actually a criminologist, professor of criminology in the US, in New York.
It's very
it's actually fascinating. It's slightly different from what you're maybe.
No, it's a different one. Yeah, you're right. So I'm not sure if that's applicable for this book, and maybe it's not. But the point here is the Islamic concept of punishment is actually different to this, because it's not about causing pain. You're not allowed to actually cause that much pain. You can't leave any permanent marks. It's about the shame that the person experiences, so they don't do it again. And the fact that from the time of the early Muslims all the way until now, you have Muslims who feel shame committing a sin. The state would not ever find out what they did. Personally coming in, turning themselves in to receive the punishment. This is an evidence that this taqwa-centric framework and style of governance is indeed possible. It just requires that the subject formation that you have, the slavery and the formation of the subject and of the individual and of the slave is not of or in relation to the state. It's about internal purification, it's about education, it's about social initiatives, it's about institutions, and all of which the state also has to enforce, their sort of civil religion. But what we have to work towards, and this is really my final point, is basically understanding that there is a way forward. However, there is a lot of intellectual work that needs to be done. We need people who are sociologists, political scientists, historians, people in the social sciences, who are also equally versed in fiqh and in usul and in aqidah, who can really synthesize the understanding of the world, that's the waqi', with understanding of the deen, that's the divine command, and pave that path forward to reforming society from the bottom up, while at the same time theorizing a blueprint. And I think here's where we really lack, theorizing a blueprint for reforming state structures from the top down. Jazakallah khair. That's most of what I wanted to say.
Very, very interesting. Thank you very much for that. Gosh, there's so many threads one could take up there and develop. So can I just throw some random things at you from my reading of your
definitely let's just
paper? Thank you. You say
organic.
If it's exactly, you say in the paper that the Islamic polity is built on an intimately powerful bond between creator and creation that is in no way dependent on state authority. That sums up pretty much what you've been saying anyway in the last few minutes. And then you have a little quote, a footnote, 27. Thus the Shemitian dictum that all significant concepts of modern political theory of the state are secularized theological concepts. This is a statement by Charles Schmitt in the concept of the political. He was his biography is extraordinary. I'm not going to go there, but anyway, he says all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts, and that struck me as absolutely true. They're not. They don't just come from a secular world. They are secularized theological concepts. Do you agree with that?
The better question, and absolutely, and I would say to complete your point, I would say, what is secularism to begin with? The moment we see the secular as just objective nothingness, just like the color white, and you can color it in with whatever you want, that's where we fail. The state, the secular is a framework provided by the state. You can fill it in with religion, you can fill it in with humanism, you can fill it in with capitalism, with whatever you want, but the state is at the top of that monopoly, or is at the top of that structure. So when I'll try to give an example. When France banned the niqab, and when they banned the hijab in schools, they did so. They, obviously Muslims, they took them to court. They took the French government to court, to the European Court of Human Rights, and they argued that this is against religious freedom because you're allowed to wear hijab, and that's an obligation in our deen. The argument that the French government made to pass the legislation to the National Assembly to pass the ban was that this was not in opposition to religious freedom, because freedom of religion is about the belief that you have on the inside. So you can practice and wear your hijab and do whatever in your own home, but the second you take that into the public, that's not the domain of religion. And obviously from an Islamic perspective, this is not true, because Islam is something which is public, it takes place outside of the home, it is social. But here's the point. France can still assert that this is secularism, because they are the ones who define religion. They define those concepts that we use to seek legitimacy for. And here's the sort of, when we have, for instance, Muslims trying to seek justice for Palestine by taking Netanyahu to the International Court of Justice, this is the same sort of fallacy that we're going through. They're the ones who designed that system. And so seeking sort of remedies from a colonial legacy system, again, it's politically, besides being theologically problematic, is also politically not tenable, because the colonialists understood, the colonists understood that if we want to change Islamic society and make it, whatever we want to make it, make it a part of the capitalist system and impose, so-called liberal freedoms or liberalism upon it, then we have to destroy all of the institutions and rebuild everything from the top. The genocide and the genocides that were committed in the process far outnumbered what we saw in Gaza, for instance. It was horrific. And so the question now is, to what extent does a similar change need to occur in order to bring it back? And that's really where Halak says, but that's beyond my pay grade. And where Muslims take that and say, actually, this definitely needs to be possible.
Okay. Another thing you say in your paper, you say, as it's talking about in an Islamic society, an authentic one, why should the monitoring and prosecution of those who disobey Allah not be a priority of an Islamic state, especially where these laws are designed to protect the society itself, and then you say the Islamic tradition is rich with responses, and then you quote an extraordinary story, a famous narration of a hadith, which I want to share because many people in the West won't know about this. It says, finally, we may recall the famous narration of Umar al-Khattab, who, as caliph, was once patrolling the streets of Medina with a companion, when they heard a rowdy party, it's a drinking party, taking place in the house of a certain companion. Upon investigating, Umar told his friend, "They are drinking alcohol right now. This is in Medina. What do you think we ought to do?" His companion responded, "I think we have fallen into what Allah prohibited. Allah prohibited us, saying, and do not spy on one another, for we had indeed spied." So, this whole idea of spying in Islam on Muslims, the Prophet upon him peace instructed people that spying, or an act of seeking out secretly or opening the faults of people, is itself a cause of moral corruption, and that applies to those in authority as well, including those who are caliphs. And so you get this extraordinary, you have the private realm and you have the public realm, and you're not supposed to spy on people. So this idea, even in a full-orbed Islamic context, the state can't intrusively seek out faults of people, to expose them, to bring them into the public domain. No, they are to remain there, because we have the emphasis on the fear of God. It's not on the fear of the state, it's on the fear of God. So it's between you and God. Doesn't mean that sins become halal, but in terms of the state's surveillance and prosecution of wrongdoing, that is limited. It's limited by strict boundaries, which you discuss in your paper. I thought that was very interesting. A lot of people are not aware of that. Maybe even some Muslims. I don't know.
Absolutely. When we think in terms of, because we think in terms of modernity in the modern state, when we try to seek an Islamic solution to a problem, we will often make the very same mistakes. Whereas we don't realize that interfering in a person's private matters or in the private sin, as long as someone else is not being harmed in the process, actually it's not only against the concept of a person fearing God, it interferes with the personal relationship that person has with God, because later on, maybe they're sinning now, but they'll reform themselves at a later point in time. And I think from an Islamic governance perspective, this needs to be complemented by the way Islamic governments treats the governors themselves, because the way the Islamic law treats the governors is in fact very harsh. You can send spies on them, you can collect intelligence on them, you can follow them around, you can literally go into their house, right, as Umar famously did on many occasions. Well, he would invite them and be like, "Look, we received reports that you're eating white bread. We received reports that you're riding a fancy horse. We received reports that you have fancy clothing. You better change that or I'm going to fire you." And the point here is that the Islamic style of governance is harsh on the governors, because they're expected to set that standard, and easy and relaxed with the public. And today we look at the modern state, and you look at corrupt states, or even so-called with states with little levels of corruption. It's the exact opposite. The political elites, they get off on any crimes that they commit, from personal injustices to stealing money to anything else. And the people are the ones who have to, the citizens have to bear the brunt of all of the oppression and the crime.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. Can I just broach another controversial question, which I know is controversial even amongst Muslims? But what is Islamic governance in terms of the polity? Is the caliphate a key concept in Islamic governance? Is it normative in Islam, or is it now an outdated and historically questionable idea of rulership that we should anyway get rid of in favor of other more modern / Western ideas? Just how important is the caliphate in Islamic governance theory?
Thank you for asking this question, because I think that the second we treat this as a question that permits different levels of different opinions, we actually lose sight of our epistemology. And the epistemology is the fact that knowledge comes from our Creator, because God is the truth and haqq and the explanation of reality. And for that reason, and the fact that, as narrated by Imam Ahmad, the Prophet ﷺ said that there will be caliphate upon the method of prophecy, and then says there will be different types of government. And at the very end, he says, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, there will be khilafa, thumma takunu khilafa ala minhaj al-nubuwah. Then the Prophet ﷺ was silent after that. So this is something that epistemologically we know is absolutely true and it's going to happen, and therefore it plays a major role. But what I do want to get to, Brother Paul, is this point, which is when we talk about normative Islamic governments, that is the caliphate. What we have done, or what we've allowed for the Western media to do, is create a caricature of what the caliphate is. And there are certain groups who claim to have established the caliphate, for instance, associate Islam with that, and then we say, "Oh no, I don't want the caliphate because this is what the media has told me it is." And this again goes back to epistemology. When we're educated by the state, we're educated by public education and mass media and social media, and we don't think for ourselves, and we don't seek that we don't make that epistemological shift to receiving guidance and receiving knowledge from divine revelation. That's when we make those mistakes.
Right. So I mean, so you're saying that then the return of the caliphate is actually prophesied. It's there in authentic hadith. This is slightly off your paper, but I'm just curious to know: should Muslims who are aware of this fact and conscientious in the practice of their deen, should we then energetically seek to reestablish it in the world with all the risks that entails? Or is it something that will come as a gift from God, if you like? Is something that He will bring about? And maybe this is a false juxtaposition, a false antithesis, but is it something that He will bring about in His good time, and therefore we wait patiently for the institution, the instantiation of this reality in our world? In other words, a more kind of not passive, but kind of non-active process, waiting for it to happen. What is the relationship between these two dialectics? I don't quite understand. It's going to happen, and yet it is a political human institution in terms of it is peopled and run by people. It's not a supernatural, miraculous entity. What do we do in the meantime before it comes into existence? If you see what I mean.
This is again brilliant questions. Jazakallah khair. We can look at this from a fiqh perspective, and we can also look at it from a social/political perspective. From a fiqh perspective, after the passing of the Prophet ﷺ, the Muslims, the Sahaba, they gathered together, and they did not, on discharge of any communal obligations, including the janazah prayer, including sending an army against the Romans, and any other communal obligations, they abstained from them until after they chose the Khalifa. And this is a clear evidence that the most important of communal obligations is the unity of the Ummah. And the unity of the Ummah can only be under the famous statement of Umar radiallahu anhu, that the Islam can only be with a jama'ah, and the jama'ah can only be with an imara. The jama'ah is a group, and the group with the ummah, and the ummah can only exist with imara, with governance, and governance can only exist with by hearing and obeying. So this from a fiqh perspective. And you might, so this is an obligation, and whether or not there's going to be whether or not we see the result is besides the point. Right? The famous hadith: whoever sees an evil amongst you, let him change it by his hand, and if he's not able to, by his tongue, and if he's not able to, with his heart. So if we see that evil, we see this problem, and we're able to change it with our hands, right? If you have the political power to do so, then of course, this is definitely something which is upon you. And if not, then you do what we're doing right now, which is speaking about it and speaking the truth. From a social/political perspective, here's what people don't understand. Like you mentioned, whether it's the caliphate or whether it's the conquering of Constantinople or whether it's anything that's prophesized, these are things that will happen or that will be undertaken by real human beings. They're not going to be, angels. They're not going to be other types of magical beings. They're going to be human beings who created, in other words, you see the army of the Mahdi, and then the Isa comes, alayhi salam, comes after the Mahdi. Here's the question: where on earth did the Mahdi get the ideological and the political and the social capital required to conquer Constantinople? Right. That's not something easy to do. There has to be a pre-existing capital. It has to come from somewhere. The answer is it's going to come from the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's going to come from us.
Okay. But what I like about your answer is that it's fundamentally optimistic, that at the end of the day, the division of the Ummah Muslims separated in these stateless nation states where, say, an Egyptian Muslim has to get an actual visa to go to Jordan, another Muslim country to study and to travel. Whereas before in the past, you were free just to move on God's earth amongst the Muslim world. Now everything is compartmentalized in these state structures. There's a very unnatural, un-Islamic reality, unfortunately. But you're saying your vision of the future is optimistic. It's based on prophecy, which is not a human invention. It's a God-given, God-inspired truth and epistemology of our faith, and therefore we can hope that this outcome will prevail, inshallah.
Can I make a point?
Please.
Sorry, just because it just occurred to me, so it would be amiss if we miss this point. So basically, what I guess to summarize this point, it is to say that among contemporary Islamic political movements and political theorists, there is again a divide. There are some people who say, yes, this is an obligation, and it's the al-Fara'id, and we have to work towards it, and this is absolutely right. But in doing so, they will overlook other areas of development. They'll overlook grassroots movements developing their local communities. They'll overlook a spiritual development and what is it called, purification of the soul. They'll overlook community endeavors and local issues because they're focused on this global solution. And then you have others on the other side who say, yes, we do know it's going to happen. Eventually, there's going to be a khilafah ala minhaj an-nubuwwah, and we believe this. However, we have to work right now with what we have, which is we have the local communities. We can work and purify ourselves. We can do dhikr. We can do charity. We can set up masajid. We can set up madrasas, and we can work on a local scale. And for me, there is no contradiction between these. You can do both at the same time. And this is sort of the point behind I guess, this Ummadic's paper, which is to say that sort of, what is it called, adopting Islamic epistemology to answering these questions has to be comprehensive. And people who say that it is comprehensive, often we focus on one side, leaving out the other. But in reality, it needs both, again, a strong grounding in the sciences of this dunya and the social sciences, etc., but also in fiqh and usul and the ability to extract those rulings from a traditional framework which takes place outside of the gaze of the modern state.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. Well, I think that's a natural place to conclude. And I do strongly urge people to read the article, Divergent Statecrafts Between Islamic Governance and Modern State Power, which is, the link is in the description below. Absolutely, in fact, there's so much more in this article than we've had chance to talk about now, because we've only had just under an hour, but it's really worth the effort, I think. So thank you very much, Dr. Jaan Islam, for your time, your great scholarship, and your new role in Turkey at the university there in Istanbul. Wish you well with your studies, and
thank you for your kind words. We hope to
in a few weeks, isn't it? I think in Turkey.
Absolutely. Yeah. I hope to see you soon. It will be great to have you for a talk.
Inshallah, we look forward to that. So thank you very much. Until next time. Assalamu alaikum.